The Bible gives us tantalizing hints about the future, mysterious prophecies. One of these is who is the restrainer of the Antichrist. It seems like a mystery, but in this video, we're going to try to solve it. In his second letter to the believers in Thessaloniki, Paul wrote about a power that was restraining the Antichrist from coming on the scene. This was something Paul had explained to the Thessalonians when he was with them. So when Paul wrote to them, he said they already knew what was restraining the Antichrist because he told them before. But 2,000 years later, we scream, "No, Paul, we don't know. We really wish you had fully explained it." But luckily, there are clues in the text that will help us figure it out. But because it isn't spelled out clearly in the Bible, Christians have begun to guess who or what is restraining the Antichrist. Some think it may be the United States of America. Some think it may be the church. Some think Jesus. And then there are the two most popular choices, the Holy Spirit and the Archangel Michael. So let's put on our Sherlock hat once again and see what the Bible has to say about it. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians because he had learned they were scared they had missed the rapture and were living during the wrath of God, known as the day of the Lord. Paul reassured them they weren't. Paul began by explaining to the Thessalonians that they hadn't missed the rapture because two signs had to occur first before the rapture: a great rebellion from the faith and the revealing of the Antichrist. And Paul was quick to point out what the revealing of Antichrist will look like. The whole world can know who the Antichrist is when he sits in the newly built temple of God in Jerusalem and proclaims himself to be like God. The Thessalonians hadn't missed this sign. The whole world will someday see it. Christians call this event the abomination of desolation, and it will occur at the midpoint of the tribulation period. Paul was referring to this verse from Daniel the prophet, who foretold the Antichrist desecrating the temple at the midpoint. Paul then made this very human statement. In today's language, we might say, "Come on, guys, don't you remember? We talked about these things when I was with you." And it is at this point where Paul gave us this frustrating verse that the Thessalonians already knew what was restraining the Antichrist, and that this restraint would continue until the Antichrist would be revealed in his time. What was that time? The abomination of desolation that occurs at the midpoint of the tribulation period. Also notice the restrainer was at work in Paul's day. This is a big clue because it eliminates things like the U.S. government or the United Nations that are modern institutions. They can't be the restrainer because the restrainer was already working in Paul's day. So let's assemble what we've learned so far. We know the restrainer continues his restraint until the midpoint of the tribulation period, and that the restrainer was at work in Paul's day. This brings up an interesting point. What is the restrainer restraining? Does he restrain anything other than just the Antichrist? Yes, he does. It's something called the mystery of lawlessness that the restrainer restrains. In fact, in the Greek text, it's the mystery of the lawlessness. And this force was already at work back in Paul's day. Now, most assume lawlessness is civil disobedience. But is that the type of lawlessness the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, will have? No. The Antichrist will have his own, probably very repressive laws. He isn't an anarchist. It's God and his law that the Antichrist will oppose. That is biblical lawlessness, an opposition to God and his righteousness. When will this reach its peak? Psalm 2 tells us the day will come when the nations and kings of the earth will try to reject the Lord and His Christ. It is into this environment that the Antichrist arises, when the mystery of the lawlessness, the anti-God sentiment, reaches its peak. So when we see anti-God attitudes rise, attitudes that reject God's laws and natural order, especially on an international level, we know the mystery of the lawlessness is growing. But there is a restrainer at present. And this tells us one more thing about the restrainer. He is powerful. He keeps Satan's plans and Satan's antichrist at bay. The restrainer is Satan's equal, and thus must be a very powerful supernatural force. So if we go back to our original propositions, the restrainer can't be the United States of America because it didn't exist in Paul's day. And it can't be the church because we aren't Satan's equals. This would immediately make you think it's either Jesus or the Holy Spirit, because only God is Satan's equal, right? Well, actually, that is very, very wrong. This gives Satan way too much credit. Satan is just a fallen angel. He is in no way God's equal. Michael, the archangel, is Satan's equal. In Revelation 12, we find a reference to Michael. It's an out-of-this-world passage about a war in heaven that takes place right before the Great Tribulation begins, which, if you remember, happens to be the exact time the Antichrist is revealed. Michael is able to overcome Satan, obviously showing he is powerful enough to be the restrainer. So Michael can't be eliminated just yet on this basis alone. In fact, this issue favors him. So let's add this to what we've learned so far. The restrainer is powerful enough to restrain Satan. So we're left with three candidates. Let's return then to our three main choices, and let's consider how each one might fulfill the role of the restrainer. Jesus is God and is currently seated at the right hand of the Father. All authority in heaven and on earth has been granted to him. So he and the Spirit, who is also God, are ultimately in charge of what is restrained and what is released. They have the authority to restrain or not to restrain. But do they delegate that role to another, or do they perform it directly? Jesus is seated, so he does not appear to be doing any hands-on restraining. And, as we said, the Spirit is God and can command the restraint of evil, but in the Bible, it is mute about him actively doing it in any type of hands-on manner. Those favoring the pre-tribulation rapture theory assume the Spirit restrains evil by influencing individual Christians to restrain evil in their environment. Michael is an archangel. An archangel means ruler angel or lead angel. And Michael is the only angel that we know that is given this title. He appears in 4 chapters of the Bible. In the book of Jude, he retrieves the body of Moses. But the other 3 mentions all seem related to this topic of restraining. So let's see how that might be. In the 10th chapter of the book of Daniel, we get the curtain pulled back on an incredible angelic battle between good angels and evil angels. This is almost like something out of Star Wars. Michael contends against the evil angels called the princes of Persia and Greece. So Michael seems to play a role in restraining evil. And in the 1st century, when Paul was writing, ancient documents of Jews and Christians both portray Michael as playing a significant end-time role in fighting against evil. In another portion of the book of Daniel, we see that at a future point, Michael will change his role. And what is most interesting about this is the timing of when Michael arises, right at the time of trouble that Jesus told us was the Great Tribulation in Matthew 24:21. We know this begins at the abomination of desolation, or midpoint of the tribulation, the exact time that the restraining of Antichrist ceases. Is this just coincidence? Hardly. In the preceding verse, we see that the Antichrist arrives on the scene at the Holy Mountain, or the Temple Mount. So this places both the Antichrist and Michael at the scene of the crime, so to speak, at exactly the same time. And as we mentioned before, in Revelation 12, the great war in heaven between Michael and Satan takes place at this exact moment in time, at the midpoint. We like to include a little bonus concept at the end of each of our videos. This one is a little bit of a guess on our parts. But is Satan's war in heaven a diversionary tactic to cause Michael to release the lawlessness on earth and be occupied fighting against Satan instead? That would certainly allow Satan's great master plan of the Antichrist to be revealed. We don't know, but it's a possibility. If it is true, it backfires because Satan is then hurled to the earth and loses his place in heaven. So if we return to our three main clues, let's see how each of the three candidates fit the criteria. We see that all three of our candidates for restrainer are powerful enough to restrain the power of lawlessness and keep the Antichrist from emerging. All three were in existence in Paul's day. However, in regard to the first clue, we've seen two examples where Michael is active at the very moment the restraint ends, the midpoint of the tribulation period. In contrast, the pre-tribulationists assume the Holy Spirit removes his restraining force prior to the tribulation in a pre-trib rapture, as saints are removed. If you remember, this theory assumes the Spirit causes the saints to restrain the Antichrist. However, the timing of this event, a pre-trib rapture, is all wrong. The restraint ends at the midpoint of the tribulation, not prior to it. The revealing of the Antichrist isn't before the tribulation. It's when Antichrist sits in the temple of God. And as we've seen, Daniel the prophet has told us this takes place halfway through the tribulation period. So this idea of the Holy Spirit being taken out of the way in a pre-trib rapture is just another mistaken theory. And although it is only circumstantial evidence, the evidence in favor of Michael being the restrainer seems convincing. We know the restrainer cannot be a current earthly government because it was active in Paul's day. It can't be the church because the church isn't a he, and the Antichrist is definitely called a he in 2 Thessalonians 2:7. And second, the church isn't Satan's equal. It also can't be a pre-tribulational event happening at a pre-trib rapture because the revealing of Antichrist is later, at the midpoint. And this final clue is the decisive one that tips the scales in favor of Michael in my mind. So although God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit authorized the restraint, it appears they delegated to Michael the Archangel. Wow, this certainly has been a mysterious prophecy. Who is the restrainer of the Antichrist is still a bit of a mystery, but the Archangel Michael is our best guess.